Afternoon, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to the next session. My name is Sinetemba. I am from Safol Steel. I am responsible for marketing there. My job right now is just to introduce our next speaker. On our South African soil, its structure we raise is a testament to the potential of our nation. Its newly designed landscape and its freshly revealed facade ushers us further forward to continue building on this foundation of purpose and promise. There's one name that's always here to support the makers and creators who know how to leave their mark, Safol Steel. When we observe the cities, spaces, and buildings around us, everything from community and climate to the economy forms part of the foundation. It carries weight, leading us in the way forward. But does the reverse also apply? Can architecture equally influence community, climate, economy? If we recognize the connection between industries as a mutually impacted system, can we regenerate the industry? Here to investigate these questions is Mokena Makeka, a multi-hyphenate powerhouse in the world of architecture and design, with expertise that has crowned him as the new president of the South African Institute of Architects. Mokena brings a wealth of knowledge and ingenuity, which is set to re-inspire the design future. Please welcome to the stage Mokena Makeka.
Good morning. Is this mic working? This side? Everybody can hear me? Fantastic. Hey, good to see some familiar faces. So let me start by saying that as we speak, there's a gathering happening in Nairobi, in Kenya, and I've been privileged to be a part of that, the Africa Climate Week and the Africa Climate Summit. And at that gathering, the proposition is being put forward that the future of the planet can only be made by Africa being a conscious participant in climate change and climate opportunities. This conversation is also being replicated in many other cities of the world at present, and there are lots of discussions about the impact of climate change on our environments, and that includes agriculture, that includes where we build our cities, that includes our everyday lives. And of course, we are all aware of the various climate crises we've seen around the world. Last year, we saw floods in Durban. We're very familiar with the Cape Town water crisis. We've seen the fires in California. We're seeing a whole range of climate-induced disasters. And there's a causal relationship between the nature of how we create our cities and how the environment is responding. I've practiced for 18 years as an architect and an urbanist. A large portion of those years engaged with this question of how do we move beyond sustainability. I also happen to sit on the board of the Green Building Council of South Africa. I also happen to sit with the Commonwealth of Architects looking at the question of climate resilience construction. And I'm also part of the bio-based construction movement, which is a global movement of architects and urbanists all over the world, including the Vatican and a whole other range of actors who are interested in this question about how do we build, where do we build, and for whom do we build. And for this reason, I'm not going to show you buildings today, because there comes a time when I think architecture must be engaged with the question of the manifesto. And those of you who do know architectural history, there have been these periodic moments when architects have stood up and made particular statements about how they believe cities should be constructed. And it's in the creation of those particular manifestos that movements are created, and through movements that are created, taste becomes generated. And once taste is generated, appetite is consumed, and that appetite is basically how the market responds. We are in a very pivotal moment in terms of defining what is the taste of our future cities in order for us to protect our natural resources. I care as much about our rivers, as our forests, as our soil quality, as our sidewalks, as well as our facades. So the impetus in this particular moment right now is for architects to move beyond the domain of the building itself, but to think of architecture as a systemic contribution to the built environment. The capital and labor flows that go into how buildings are made are just as important in terms of the material selection as well as the lighting and the look and feel. Now, you might ask, why is this important today? And why am I telling you this in essentially what is a trade fair and an opportunity to showcase a common understanding of what is architecture? I think this is a moment for a manifesto, for an opinion, for a sort of statement about where we need to go forward as a society. There are systemic implications for policy making, there are implications for construction, there are implications for planning approvals, there are implications for the very nature of the cities that we create. Now, to anchor this sort of idea, I've developed a model alongside with a number of actors called Flow, and it's about understanding the future of living for one world, and how do we use architecture to demonstrate what does it mean to live within one world principles. If we think of the desire for job creation, for amazing livelihoods and so on, and we aspire to a particular, I would say, for lack of a better phrase, American model for development, and if all of us on this planet was to live in that way, it would mean that we'd require 2.3 planets in order to maintain that lifestyle. So we cannot be sustainable if we are not thoughtful about our consumption, and those who do have to consume differently, and those who do not have should not be told that they must fall behind, but they also have a narrative in terms of the making of what this world must be. So this means that we need to think carefully about how do we monetize, maximize the resources, understanding that we live within one planet and we should not live within 2.3 planets as a principle. So this means we need to think carefully about the material choices that we're using in our buildings. We need to think about the efficiency of those particular buildings, and we need to also understand that we will still need to build because of demographic change. Now, the preamble towards 2050, now why do I say this? I want to bring it back to history. My previous speaker spoke a little bit about some of the Le Corbusier and other moments in our architectural history. I want to talk about the importance and the power of the manifesto, because essentially, if you look in 1928 at the Congress of International Architects of Modernity, where Le Corbusier and other architects came together, the manifesto there was to say the way that they're going to solve the housing challenge of that time was to use industrialized materials. It was very much building on the history of Gropius and others and looking at the Bauhaus, but that was when we begin to see a huge thrust aesthetically as well as conceptually towards the use of concrete and steel in order to reimagine cities. At the end of World War II, the Marshall Plan became a very big vehicle for this because obviously given the devastation of many cities that were based on wood and other sorts of materials, there was an alliance between concrete industries, between architects, between politicians to reimagine the city of the future, essentially using concrete. And long story short, the world that we've inherited right now is really a result of a concerted and serious and considered effort about the reimagination of cities. Unfortunately, they were unaware of climate change, they were unaware of carbon, they were unaware of many of the sort of effects of that rapid industrialization. And we are now the generation that are reaping these benefits. And for those of you who are fathers, grandparents, grandmothers, either present or to be, I think we must be seized with the question of what type of world will we give to our children or grandchildren 20 years from now if we continue to build in the way that we do at the moment. So if we embrace this question of one world principles, it means that we have to demonstrate agency and urgency in order to effect broad-scale change. So we envision an avant-garde world with a regenerative dialogue with planet and human need, focused and led by a network of architects and urbanists, but offering solutions and insights for all of humanity. Now, why is this serious? Again, this is not just about Cape Town. Here are some statistics about the rise of cities. We have a global youth, global South youth burden or dividend, depending on how we look at it, where the average age of many of our countries are at least below the age of 29. In some countries, the average age is 19. How are we going to unlock this talent between now and 2035? How are we going to allow the creation of our cities in such a way that this youth is unlocked and are not seen as a problem for society? So we have to imagine, what does it mean? Africa will have the largest portion of the global workforce in the next 20 to 30 years, but what will they be doing? So we have to think very differently about the materials that we choose. We have to think very differently about our demographic evolution. We have to be very, very thoughtful about our economic strategy. And in many countries, the construction sector is seen as a vital component of economic development and economic strategy. It is not seen as an add-on to development. So I would argue that we need to think very, very carefully about how this population change will manifest across the continent. Places such as the Congo Basin are expected to double in population by the year 2050. Cape Town is already, like many other cities, as you can see over that side, will be experiencing this growth. And the question is, how do we make equitable and affordable cities for all? And we have to tie that back to a number of key decisions. Now, some of you may know these statistics about the carbon footprint related to buildings and construction. A significant proportion of our carbon footprint and effect on climate change comes through the construction process. Now, we live in an age where historically the architect is agnostic about the carbon profile of the materials. They merely select because they like it, and the client is signed off and it's fine. And those downstream implications actually have an impact on nature. In similar fashion, if we think about building occupancy, to some extent, there's a question about the running of buildings and how do the choice of materials and windows and facade actually bring down the energy cost of buildings. But to a degree, it's also a decision that we are not technically responsible for, and perhaps rightly so. However, I think we need to start thinking of a continuum in which the materials that we choose, the construction methods that we deploy, the way in which we design should be very cognizant of the overall carbon profile of these buildings. Because as much as you might say this is just my single project, once you aggregate these into neighborhoods, into cities, etc., the substantial impact on the planet is vast. Just by way of example, people would say that the Industrial Revolution began in 1830 in the United Kingdom. And if you look at the amount of reduction of forest cover, degradation of natural landscapes, by various measures, 30% of the world's natural resources, natural forest, etc., have been degraded since 1830. And if you look at the history of the planet and the history of our species, that is quite a significant negative impact, which we have to think about very carefully. So the question is, what can we do if we imagine between 1928 up until now, 2023, just under 100 years, what will the next 100 years of construction be like? What is the level of imagination that is required for us to unlock these future cities, and so on? And 950 million people will be in these African cities. So I'm interested in how we can understand cities' role as a primary contributor of carbon emissions, understanding that overall, we are currently, cities themselves will be home to 7 billion people by 2050, and how can we see smart green growth as a path towards nature-positive future. And what I mean by nature-positive, there's been lots of discussion about net zero and other sorts of targets. The difficulty with net zero is that it doesn't take into account the impact on biodiversity. So when we start to talk about nature positive, it's about creating developments where we know that you're not only not harming the environment, but in fact you're actually increasing biodiversity. So we need to start thinking about if we're taking a certain material from here and it's being mined in a landscape, and in that landscape flora and fauna are being affected, that therefore becomes a nature negative act. So we need to be very thoughtful about design, we need to think very carefully about carbon accounting, and we need to think very carefully about how do we work on development. Now, I do want to talk about the type of cities that are beginning to emerge, in part to response to this, and I think there's a degree of, I'll be cautious about the words I use. Let's just say that there's good models and there's bad models. This is essentially where we want to go towards is the top right-hand model, what I describe as the adaptive city. The adaptive city has a number of key features. It's low-tech. Low-tech means essentially the ability for those cities to engage local citizens in the repairing and the realization of those cities. You might have heard of many different technical solutions that this will make a city climate smart or sustainable, etc. We have to think, can that infrastructure be sustained by locals? Can it be innovated by locals? Can it be enhanced by locals? And if that's the case, that takes us towards the adaptive city. It means we need to start thinking very carefully about nature-positive urban planning. And that has an implication not just for how we manage natural landscapes, but also how we think about cities. Where does the food come from that drives our cities? Are we eroding further hinterlands? Can we think more critically about urban agriculture? Can we start taking advantage of, in some cities, where we've seen abandonment of buildings due to COVID, can those buildings not become the future farms of the city? So this is about being very, very innovative about understanding the principles of the adaptive city. Where we don't want to be is on the bottom left-hand corner. This is the status quo, where you have small, very cute middle-class enclaves, essentially slum neglect. We have a sort of green status quo where people talk about the smart neighborhood, look at my development, etc., but it doesn't fix the broader urban problem. And then you'd have the traditional smart city, which you see on the bottom right hand, where, and many cities that I've visited do this well. We've got this project, we've got IoT, we've got that, but essentially it doesn't take us towards that affordable and exclusive sort of paradigm, which is at the top right hand, where biourbanism comes into it. And this notion of biourbanism is not new, but it's about understanding the interrelationship between how we make our cities and nature. And when we talk about biourbanism, it's a range of concerns. It's about humanity, food, energy, economy, mobility, structure, technology, water, waste, and landscape. And it's about understanding that the adaptive city takes this into account. Unfortunately, many of the ways that we look at our planning approvals, the way that we train our architects and urban designers, the way that we think about development, we would like to aggregate and parse out these opportunities in order to increase value capture. But in the increase of that segmented value capture, what you find is that overall, we have systemic degradation. So we need to work towards a new sort of biourbanism that understands ecology as part of the design fabric of a city and place. Now, this is a diagram produced by a good friend of mine, Alan Orogansky, in the US. We do a lot of work on timber and bio-based solutions in construction, and it's an interesting diagram because what it begins to demonstrate is the relationship between historic atmospheric carbon, which would be your forests, terrestrial carbon, which is below ground, but you can see this sort of causal relationship that by actually digging into the ground to exploit oil and carbon and resources, and the sort of inverse relationship in terms of how those economies of scale are actually making buildings quite culpable for let's call it this carbon dividend, and then saying, now how do we invert that between 2020 and 2050 in such a way that we use bio-based construction so that our cities actually become more of carbon sinks in terms of absorbing carbon, but not places which actually produce carbon. And this means a different choice of material. One of the fascinating things about going back to the CIAM movement, Le Corbusier and others, there was a debate about aesthetics. Would concrete buildings look good? I mean, he famously lost the Palace of Soviets competition because of this building being too modern. And at the time, there was this notion of a sort of neoclassical sort of architecture, and they took it upon themselves to change taste. Very fascinating. And then we see the emergence of minimalism. We see the emergence of the aesthetics of concrete and steel. And they, over time, over a few generations, were actually able to change the aesthetic sensibility of the marketplace. And that is why the modern movement continues to be so powerful towards today. So people say to me, how can we imagine a new city, new architecture? We require courageous architects who are willing to participate in this question of re-articulating taste, but using the appropriate and right materials that are good for the planet. Now, what does that actually mean? And I'll just quickly share this slide before I move on, because there are other knock-on effects about using bio-based materials when it comes to the planet. I've done some research with food and agriculture organizations showing how a humble tree, as opposed to, let's say, concrete, allows you a whole different range of different subproducts, whether it's the bark, whether it's the leaves or the fiber itself that can even make clothing, etc. So it is a renewable material. So as we start to transition our construction towards renewable opportunities, a single tree such as this can unlock 20 different value chains, depending on how you structure it. And I'm currently doing work in the Congo Basin, in Kenya, and a couple of other places, including Mozambique, working with foresters and understanding what is the climate mitigation potential by increasing forest cover, what are the sorts of business opportunities that come out by actually planting forests for construction, and there should be a report coming out later on this year on Africa's bioeconomy potential, which will be adopted by a number of countries. And this is in order to create the actual wood fiber stock that will be required to support this revolution in terms of construction materials. Now, how do we measure this and how do we understand it? Because people say, well, how do we know that it works? We've developed a model called the 4C framework, which is community, capital, climate, and circularity. Community is about understanding if this material has an impact on community participation, engagement, workforce, labor, etc. Does it actually respond to the needs of capital? the banking world, the finance world, the climate smart world, the green fund world? Does it actually respond to those needs? Circularity. When we think about the materials that we choose to make buildings, are those buildings designed in such a way that they can be redesigned? Are the waste products inputs into other business systems? Are there ways that we can actually reduce the overall waste process from a typical design process? So I don't just select materials anymore and say, well, I like aluminium. I ask the question, how does this aluminium support community? How does this aluminium tap into capital from a green perspective? How does it contribute to circularity? And how does it contribute to climate? And through this 4C framework, it gives us the ability to make not only aesthetic decisions about materials, but allows us to make conscious, scientifically based, rational decisions, which I can tell a client, this material choice is good for the planet and it looks good. Now, in order to do that, we had to go through a process of benchmarking. It means that we think very carefully about buildings, not just as aesthetic choices, but actually as strategic choices. And it's also about partnerships. So indeed, vertical integration becomes important. I'm working in Cape Town and in Nairobi and also in Gabon, where we're vertically integrating with forest plantations at source to actually create these buildings. Now, for example, if this sounds absolutely crazy, Chart Cathedral, which burnt down several years ago, not many people know that there's a forest called Chart Forest. And in fact, there was the selection of the timber that was actually used to make those beams in that building, those about 1,000 years ago. It was the architect working side by side with the forester, selecting the specific tree, making sure that they were not impacting negatively on the landscape, putting it into the structure, and those beams stayed intact for 1,000 years. So arguably, that carbon that has been locked in that wood, we don't make buildings that last 1,000 years anymore. We don't even make them to last 20 years or more. Lucky if it's 5. And maybe the guarantee your door handles 1 year. So we have a big problem in terms of the products that we're using in our buildings. We have a big problem from a climate perspective, but also we are disconnected from the source. We are disconnected from the material. And this is because of the last 100 years of industrialization, where the architect says, I'm only focused on the performance of the material in technical terms. But now we need to change that definition. I'm interested in the performance of the material in technical terms, capital terms, climate and circularity, and that's why I'll pick this material over that one. And ultimately, the more we do that as designers and architects, it means that our clients will make better informed decisions. They will also become part of the solution, and we won't be passive servants of taste, but will actually be agents of change. And I wanted to share an image of a particular project which I've developed, which takes those principles. Unfortunately, Gabon has had a coup d'etat a week and a half ago, so the project is in limbo. But having said that, the approach behind this project does that full integration, right down to specifying the wood from the particular forest, working with a specific community, engaging with a number of technocrats around the world about can you use wood as a facade material, engaging with the client, in this case it's the United Nations, understanding this building in terms of its carbon profile. I've measured the amount of carbon that I've saved on this building. It's equivalent to 23 737s in weight, which is actually quite fascinating, just by making strategic choices about the proportion of concrete and steel and replacing them with bio-based materials. There is still eco-concrete in the basement. There is still steel in some instances, but it's by, again, to my point about shifting taste, if architects are thoughtful about the relationship between their aesthetics and their climate decisions, if we aggregate this at scale, we can start to imagine a new type of urbanism, so that 50 to 100 years from now, we will look back and say, yes, there was this 100-year period where human beings had no consciousness of climate, and these are the buildings that they built. But for the next 100 years, this is how they improved, and this is how they created a new sort of bio-based urbanism that was regenerative, that created jobs, and that allowed for better equity in terms of landscape. So I'm sorry I don't have many architectural projects for you. I've done this before where somebody said to me, we wanted to see your buildings. My intention today is to make a call for a manifesto for change. It might not resonate today, but I think change is coming. If we think of the planet is already giving us many, many signals. 2030 Sustainable Development Goals are on the horizon. I happen to sit in many discussions, including National Treasury, the big banks, about green bonds, about understanding where capital is moving. Some of you may or may not know that there's going to be a a hit on South African products because of the EU tax on embodied carbon and our goods. And government is thinking quite intensely about that. So even the way we manufacture our steel, we now need to start using other forms of sustainable energy because of the embodied carbon that's going into it. So my plea or manifesto to you all is, I don't expect this change to happen overnight, but I do think that we can, if we are as bold and as confident as the architects of 1928 and the 1930s, in terms of reshaping the world around them. I think that we can reshape the world for our children and grandchildren. But it does mean retooling our taste, retooling our understanding of design, and retooling industry, and that will require partnership. But that's why I've stopped making buildings for my ego, because I want to save the planet. I thank you.